In Ghana, where the finance ministry says it will suspend debt service payments on certain categories of external debt. Those affected include Eurobonds, commercial loans, and most bilateral debts. Now, the government had previously announced a domestic debt exchange program after it reached a $3 billion staff-level agreement with the International Monetary Fund. The IMF included comprehensive debt restructuring, however, as a condition for that deal going through. Ghana's public debt stood at around $55 billion by the end of September. 42% of that, however, was held within the country. All right, then let's discuss this in a bit more detail. Jude Moore is joining us from Washington, D.C. He's a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. Jude, good to have you on the program. What sort of reactions are you seeing to this in policy circles? A unilateral move to suspend debt service payments on Eurobonds, commercial debts, and, most bilateral loans?
Well, thanks for having me, Rama. I think most people who've been following this expected this. It was Ghana's position had become untenable, and at some point there was going to be a default. I think the problem is some bondholders who've been speaking to people, off the record, have indicated that the Ghanaian counterparts didn't get in touch with them, they didn't talk to them, they didn't know the exact moment what was going to happen. But I think everyone who's been following this issue expected this to happen, unfortunately.
Indeed, and the statement from the finance ministry said, payments on most bilateral debt has also been affected. But do we know, which countries' debts might still be serviced and why in that case?
I think the only debt that is going to be serviced is multilateral debt. Normally, in these kinds of circumstances, World Bank, African Development Bank, anything multilateral usually gets the service continues on this. But I think even in this case, all of the bilateral debt, and a significant portion of that bilateral debt is obviously China, but as a percentage of Ghana's entire debt is pretty small. So I don't know if there's a bilateral creditor out there who's going to escape this. I think all of the bilateral creditors are going to be affected by this.
Indeed, and there was an interesting line in the statement from the finance ministry, something to the lines of, we expect an expedited resolution from our bilateral creditors. But given how the G20 common framework has worked out so far, in Ethiopia's case, obviously they had a civil war, but in Chad's case, those negotiations just dragged on and on and on. Same thing that we're seeing now in Zambia. So that hope for an expedited resolution, that's a bit optimistic on Ghana's part, isn't it?
Very, very. We haven't seen anything. I mean, look at Sri Lanka, look at Zambia, look at like the countries you listed. We haven't seen any expedited resolution so far. However, I think the clarity with with which Ghana is going about this, and we might see a change here, but I doubt it. Like you said, I think they've been really, really optimistic about how fast this can happen. This, however, raises question about the common framework, where it was intended to be able to resolve these crises as quickly, as expeditiously as possible, but we're not seeing that happening. And there doesn't seem to be another international mechanism to manage this, and so it means we're stuck in this a process that keeps going on interminably at great cost to the ordinary person in the street.
Is there, in theory, is there another way of sorting this out without going through the G20 common framework? Can Ghana simply say, look, we're going to hold a conference call, Eurobond holders, commercial lenders, if it's a syndicated bank, bilateral lenders, put everyone into the same room and say, we need to sort this out amongst ourselves without going down the G20 common framework route?
It becomes really, really difficult to do this, right? Because, in the past, I say pre-2000, most of the creditors will end up being bilateral and multilateral. You can do a Paris Club deal, you can have the World Bank, IMF involved in it. But now a significant portion of Ghana's debt, over 40% of that, is held by private holders. So we're talking about pension funds managers, hedge fund managers, and gathering a group of these people together to be able to negotiate with them becomes really, really difficult, requiring therefore some international mechanism that allows you to be able to do this. The problem is the mechanism we have doesn't work.
All right, then one last question for you, Jude. Now, Ghana's sort of, implemented this unilateral suspension, but what sort of restructuring offer, if any, can they actually table to external creditors?
So take for example, Zambia. Zambia is asking for haircuts that probably accrue to about $8 billion worth of its debt. And because of that, some of its bilateral creditors, especially China, have balked. I think it's the same problem we're going to run in here with Ghana. What is the scale of the haircut that is being required of creditors? And that might be the sticking point. So in the end, some of the same things are going to emerge that we've seen in the Zambia case, that we've seen in the Sri Lanka case. I feel bad for the average Ghanaian. I feel bad for what's happening in the country, but it doesn't seem that there's going to be an easy resolution to this debt crisis.